It's 1967 at Fremont Dragstrip, and a kid named Jerry James is standing near the fence when something rolls through the staging lanes that stops him cold. And decades later, he'll still be thinking about it. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the cars that shaped drag racing before anyone gave them proper names. If you're someone who loves the raw, unfiltered history of American motorsport, the regional heroes, the track rats, the guys nobody outside of a 2-county radius ever heard of who were building things 20 years ahead of their time, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now here's the thing. The cars that end up in museums and on magazine covers and in the kind of oral histories that get passed down through generations, those are rarely the whole story. Sometimes the most important cars in racing history are the ones that never left the regional circuit. The ones that showed up at a local track, ran a number that made experienced people look twice, and then disappeared into private hands without ever getting the national spotlight. And when you go looking for them decades later, what you find is fragments. A photograph from a Hall of Fame photographer. A frame from a documentary DVD. A blog comment from someone calling themselves Panic Mouse who says yes, I know where it is, and then says nothing else. The car we're talking about today is a 1955 Chevrolet 210 Club Coupe with a rear axle pushed forward 2 feet, a GMC 671 blower screaming through a hole cut in the hood, and a fuel mix of gasoline and 10% nitromethane running through a Hilborn injection setup that a man named Ted Gotelli helped make competitive. It ran a 9.73 at 146 miles per hour at Fremont Dragstrip in the Bay Area somewhere around 1966 to 1968. Its name was Blown Hell. Its builder and driver was Rinauro. And the story of why he built it and what it represented at that exact moment in drag racing history is the kind of thing that makes you understand why some people never stop digging through old racing archives. Before we get into the Blown Hell itself, you need to understand the world Rinauro came from. Because here's what most people don't realize when they look at a car like this. The choices that seem radical in hindsight almost always make complete sense when you understand the competitive environment that produced them. Rinauro wasn't being eccentric. He was responding to a world that was changing around him faster than the rulebooks could keep up. The NHRA gas coupe and sedan classification, what everyone called the gasser class, was one of the most popular categories in drag racing through the early to mid-60s. The rules were simple in concept. Cars ran on gasoline only, they had to maintain a stock-appearing body and stock wheelbase, the driver had to sit in the factory seat location, and they were classified by a weight-to-displacement ratio. Lighter car with more motor per pound put you in the premium classes. A gas supercharged was the top of the pyramid, and it was a brutal competitive environment. Now here's why the 1933 Willis coupe became the weapon of choice for A/GS competition. And I want to be specific about this because it wasn't tradition or aesthetic. It was pure physics and economic. The 33 Willis weighed around 2,000 pounds from the factory. That is an extraordinarily light car for an American vehicle from any era. The wheelbase was 100 inches, which on launch transfers weight rearward very aggressively, helping traction. These things were built by the hundreds of thousands during the Depression when Willis was trying to sell cheap transportation for under $500, which meant by the time drag racing took off in the 50s, there were surviving examples scattered through junkyards all over the country for almost nothing. Small frontal area, light body, short wheelbase, available engine bay. If you sat down and designed the ideal starting point for a gasser racer from scratch, you'd land pretty close to what already existed in 1933. Ohio George Montgomery won NHRA Nationals Class Championships in the A/GS in 1959, 1960, 1961, 1963, 1964, and 1966 in his baby blue 33 Willis. That car is in the Henry Ford Museum now. Stone, Woods, and Cook terrorized the class in their legendary black 41 Willis for years. Big John Masmanian built his gorgeous candy apple red Willis into a crowd favorite wherever it showed up. The Willis was the car in a /GS, and everybody in the sport knew it. Ron Rinauro ran right in the middle of all that. He campaigned a 33 Willis Coupe in A/gas supercharged at Fremont Dragstrip and Half Moon Bay Dragstrip, the two main tracks in the Northern California Bay Area scene during this period. Fremont opened in 1959 and ran until 1988. Half Moon Bay opened in 1957 and closed in 1968. Between those two tracks plus occasional travel, Rinauro competed against some of the fiercest regional gasser competition in the country. Because NorCal was not a place where you could show up with a half-built program and expect to go home with any money. Here's what made Rinauro's program more than just another guy with a Willis. His engine came from Ted Gotelli. If that name doesn't mean anything to you yet, stay with me because Terrible Ted is one of those figures in California drag racing history who absolutely deserves more recognition than the mainstream tends to give him. Ted Gotelli opened Gotelli's Speed Shop at 321 El Camino Real in South San Francisco in May of 1962, and he ran that shop for 57 years until he lost the lease in 2019. That is an insane run for any small business, let alone a drag racing speed shop. Gotelli wasn't just selling parts. He was building engines. Specifically, he was one of the premier AA/fuel dragster engine builders on the West Coast, doing it at a level that put him in direct competition with guys like Don Garlits for supremacy in the fuel classes. He befriended Don Prudhomme and Connie Colita, two names that tell you exactly what caliber of people were in his orbit. He gave numerous drivers their starts in professional racing, and he built blown engines for Rinauro's Willis Gasser, which is how Rinauro ended up with competitive power in a class where the engine is everything. The East Coast Drag Times Hall of Fame article on California gassers specifically calls Gotelli out as the source of Rinauro's competitive horsepower. Quote, driver Ron Rinauro gained fame with power from famed fuel engine builder Terrible Ted Gotelli, end quote. That phrasing tells you something important. It's not just saying Rinauro bought parts from Gotelli. He gained fame because of what Gotelli was building for him. The engine relationship was the story. You were getting Gotelli-level knowledge from a man tuning fuel dragsters at the absolute edge of what was possible, and that expertise didn't disappear just because it was going into a gasser instead of a dragster. You were getting a significant competitive advantage that most of the guys Rinauro was lining up against simply didn't have access to. So Rinauro is out here at Fremont and Half Moon Bay running with legitimately elite power in a class where the other top guys are Ohio George and Masmanian and names you'll recognize if you followed the gasser era. This is not a comfortable environment. You'd better have your car sorted or you're going home early and paying for the privilege. Now there's an interesting complication in the timeline that I want to be upfront about because I couldn't fully resolve it. And I think it actually makes the story more interesting rather than less. The common way to tell this story is a clean sequential arc. Rinauro ran the Willis first, then built the blown hell, and moved on to bigger and wilder things. That's the natural progression narrative, and it might be exactly right. But there's a Spencer's Speed Shop Facebook post from July of 1967 that shows Rinauro driving their Willis at Fremont. And Spencer's Speed Shop was based in Belleville, New Jersey, which raises all kinds of questions. A New Jersey shop running their car at Fremont with a Bay Area driver in 1967. Why? Was Rinauro so well regarded that an East Coast team brought him in to pilot their car at a California track? Here's what makes this more complicated. The blown hell was already active by 1966. There's a reference to it appearing in what Drive magazine describes as the yellow dog-eared pages of a well-known magazine from 1966. So the two programs overlap. These weren't clean sequential chapters. Rinauro was building something new while still doing seat time in other teams' gassers, which is actually a pretty common pattern for drivers who are good enough to get hired and ambitious enough to be developing their own program at the same time. Look, I couldn't find a first-person account from Rinauro himself about any of this. No interview, no oral history, no quotes from the man in any accessible source. He exists in the historical record almost entirely through his machines, which is a fascinating situation because it means we can tell you a lot about what he built and where he raced it, but the interior story of what he was thinking and how he made decisions is largely unavailable to us right now. I'd rather tell you that straight than speculate my way through it. What we can say with confidence is that sometime in 1966 Ron Rinauro showed up at Fremont and Half Moon Bay with a 1955 Chevrolet 210 Club Coupe that was unlike anything people expected from a full-bodied production car, and the scene took notice immediately. Let's get into what this thing actually was, because the technical choices Rinauro made are the whole story. Once you understand them, you understand why people still talk about this car decades later. Start with the body. 1955 Chevrolet 210 Club Coupe, full steel, no fiberglass, no flip-top nose. This is important because by 1966 the trend in high-performance drag racing was moving decisively toward fiberglass bodies that weighed almost nothing. Funny cars, which were still being defined and named as a class at this exact moment, were running fiberglass shells over tube chassis because you could make them dramatically lighter than any steel body while keeping the shape of a production car for crowd appeal. Rinauro kept the steel. That's a deliberate choice. A heavier car needs more power to run the same times, but it also has different structural characteristics, and it looks fundamentally different from a lightweight glass-bodied funny car. The blown hell was always going to be a steel car, and that decision shapes everything about how it looked and ran. Now here's the modification that defines the whole car. The rear axle was moved forward approximately 2 feet. 2 feet. On a 1955 Chevy with its stock geometry, the rear axle sits back under the trunk area and the car has a relatively balanced stance. Push that axle forward 2 feet and the rear overhang extends dramatically behind the axle. There's 1.5 feet of car hanging off the back with no wheel under it. The nose goes up. The attitude changes. It looks aggressive and wrong in exactly the way that made Jerry James stop walking and stare from across the fence. Now, you might be thinking this was just an aesthetic thing, somebody trying to make their car look mean. But that's not what was happening here. Moving the rear axle forward changes where the weight transfers on launch in a way that can dramatically improve traction. When you accelerate hard in a rear-wheel drive car, weight transfers backward, compressing the rear suspension and loading the rear tires. The geometry of how that happens is affected by where the axle sits relative to the rest of the car and where the instant center of the suspension is located. Move the axle forward and you can tune that relationship to get better bite off the line, which in a car making serious power is worth real elapsed time. The blown hell was doing what the factory-backed AWB experimentals from Chrysler and Ford had proven worked in 1964 and 1965, altering the wheelbase to get better weight transfer, but in a full steel body on a Chevy platform with a blown small block running Nitro mix. Speaking of that engine, the blown hell ran a 292 cubic inch small block Chevrolet. Now here's a technical note worth being precise about. Chevrolet never made a factory 292 cubic inch small block. What they made was a 283 cubic inch small block. If you bore that engine 0.060 inches over, you land at exactly 292 cubic inches. That is a completely standard racing modification for the era, overboring the factory block to pick up displacement. The displacement was real. It just came from machining work, not a factory configuration. On top of that engine sat a GMC 671 Roots-type blower. The 671 designation comes from its original application, 6-cylinder diesel engines with 71 cubic inch cylinders. By the 60s, drag racing teams had figured out these blowers were adaptable to gasoline engines with modifications. A Roots blower is a positive displacement supercharger, which means it moves a fixed volume of air per revolution regardless of engine speed, rather than building pressure like a centrifugal blower does. At full throttle it's stuffing substantially more air into each cylinder than the engine could pull in naturally. More air means you can burn more fuel. More fuel burned means more power release. The math on forced induction is pretty direct. Fuel delivery came through Hilborn mechanical fuel injection. Hilborn was the name in racing fuel injection during this period. Their mechanical systems were on essentially every serious race car running something other than a carburetor. Ignition came from a Vertex magneto, which was the other name that appeared everywhere in serious racing applications during the 60s. The transmission was a Chrysler TorqueFlite automatic, and that choice is interesting because Chrysler's automatic was considered one of the strongest available, and teams across different brand loyalties would use it when they needed an automatic that could handle serious power. The fuel mix was gasoline with 10% nitromethane. Not straight nitro, not straight gas. 10% mixed in. That is a tuning choice that adds power over pump gasoline while staying below the full nitro commitment that fuel-altered and fuel dragster programs were running. 10% nitro on a blown small block is enough to make the thing considerably more aggressive than a purely gasoline-fueled setup, while still being something a skilled tuner can manage on a track car rather than a full-on exhibition machine. And the results? The blown hell ran a best of 9.73 seconds in the quarter mile at 146 miles per hour. That's the documented number from Drive magazine's coverage, and it's competitive for a Northern California track car in the 1966 to 1968 window. Not a national record, not a pass that sent shockwaves through Indianapolis, but a real time on a real car at real tracks in front of real crowds. And that time would have put you in serious contention at Fremont and Half Moon Bay, where Rinauro was running it. Here's something worth thinking about regarding how this car fit into the classifications of its era. If you go looking for references to the blown hell across the sources that documented it, you'll find it called different things in different places. A worth point listing for the Steve Reyes photograph from 1968 calls it a funny car. The East Coast Drag Times Hall of Fame article calls it an altered wheelbase car. Von Skip's automotive blog tags it as a gasser. A Fotke Photo Archive caption calls it a gasser AWB. 4 different sources, 4 different category labels. Here's the thing. None of them are entirely wrong. The mid to late 60s were the period when drag racing's classification system was actively trying to figure out what to do with cars that didn't fit the existing boxes. The original gasser rules required stock wheelbase. The blown hell had an altered wheelbase, so technically it wasn't running in the strict gasser class definition. But it wasn't a fiberglass-bodied flip-top funny car either. It sat in this middle space that the sport was still developing language for, and depending on when and where you encountered it, the available terminology would lead you to describe it differently. The most historically accurate descriptor is probably altered wheelbase gasser. A car that came from gasser culture and gasser construction philosophy, but whose modifications pushed it beyond what the standard A/GS rulebook allowed. By 1968, that same combination of steel body, altered geometry, supercharged engine, and nitro mix was increasingly being described as a funny car in common usage, even for cars that didn't have the fiberglass flip-top that would later define the class definitively. The name funny car itself came from people watching these AWB cars at the tracks and saying they looked funny. Something was off. Something wasn't right. The proportions were strange. And that's a description that fits the blown hell exactly. The East Coast Drag Times Hall of Fame assessment puts it plainly and accurately. They describe the blown hell as preceding current pro-modified racers by a couple of decades. Think about what pro-modified is as a class. A full-bodied production-looking car with extreme engine modifications and altered geometry running well into the 9s or 8s. That is exactly what the blown hell was doing in 1966 through 1968. The Pro-Modified class that NHRA would formally sanction in the 1990s is a direct descendant of the philosophy that cars like the Blown Hell represented. They were figuring out what Pro-Mod was going to be roughly 20 years before the class had a name. This is where it gets really interesting. To understand why the timing of the Blown Hell matters so much, you need to understand what was happening to the gasser world at that exact moment. Because the class that Rinauro had built his career in was dying. Not slowly. Dying the way things die when multiple forces converge simultaneously and suddenly what was dominant is gone. The forces were pretty clear in retrospect. First, the factory-backed altered wheelbase experimentals in 1964 and 1965 had already proven to the entire drag racing community that moving axles around to change weight transfer worked, and worked dramatically. Chrysler's Dick Landy in a '64 Dodge 330. Jack Chrisman in a supercharged Mercury Comet that had a wheelbase so radically altered it looked like it came from a different planet. Once those cars started running the times they ran, everybody knew the game had changed. Second, the nitro-burning funny cars with fiberglass bodies were starting to draw crowds in a way that track operators love. You could charge premium admission for funny car shows because the cars were spectacular in a way that stock wheelbase gassers simply couldn't match. The economics of drag racing were shifting toward the spectacle that fiberglass funny cars provided. Third, NHRA itself was changing the rules in ways that eroded the Willis monopoly in the gas classes. A 1967 rule change allowed late model cars to run in gas classifications, and once that happened, the 1933 Willis competitive edge got complicated. Because now you could potentially build a lighter fiberglass-bodied late model car that outclassed what the Willis could do while staying within the class rules. Stone, Woods and Cook abandoned their legendary 41 Willis for a Mustang funny car in 1967. Mazmanian went into the fuel funny car world in 1968. Ohio George, the most decorated Willis driver in NHRA history, transitioned through a '66 Mustang gasser and eventually to a turbocharged Pinto that would pioneer what Pro-Modified would become. NHRA officially eliminated the gas classes altogether in 1972. The class that Ron Rinauro had built his career around effectively ceased to exist within a few years of the Blown Hell's most active competition period. Rinauro was building the Blown Hell right at this inflection point, which is why the car looks like what it does. It's got one foot in the gasser world, full body, production car, small block Chevy, competition at regional tracks, and 1 foot in what was coming next. The altered wheelbase, the nitro mix, the blower sticking through the hood, the TorqueFlite automatic that lets you stage and launch differently than a manual trans car. Rinauro wasn't following a tradition. He was trying to figure out where the sport was going and building something for that future rather than for the class structure he'd come up through. Whether that was a calculated strategic decision or just the natural result of Gotelli's influence and the information flowing through the Bay Area scene, I genuinely can't tell you because we don't have Rinauro's voice on it. But the car itself is the argument. You don't accidentally build something that precise. You make choices. Now let's talk about the name. Blown Hell. I want to spend a minute on this because there's a detail worth raising about where it might have come from beyond the obvious interpretation. The obvious read is right there in the words. Blown for the supercharger on top of the engine, and hell for the aggressive character of the thing. Simple, direct, effective drag racing car naming in the tradition of calling your machine exactly what it is or what it does. But here's the detail worth noting. Rich Guasco ran a fuel altered out of the Bay Area called Pure Hell that was racing at many of the same venues Rinauro was running during this exact period. Pure Hell was a legendary car in Northern California drag racing, a fuel altered with a ferocious reputation at Fremont and other NorCal tracks. The naming parallel between Pure Hell and Blown Hell is pretty hard to miss. Same structure, same vibe, same Northern California geography. Whether Rinauro directly riffed on Guasco's naming convention or whether this was coincidence, I can't document with certainty. But the parallel exists, and it says something about the small interconnected world of Bay Area drag racing in the 60s, where everybody knew what everybody else was doing, and naming your car in a way that echoed the local legend wasn't necessarily accidental. No alternative names for the car appear anywhere in the documentation. It was blown hell from the beginning, and it stayed blown hell through its entire competition life. Here's what most people don't realize when they look at photographs of regional cars from this era. The photographic record is everything. Because without it, these machines simply cease to exist in any recoverable sense. A car that ran at a local track in the 60s and never made a national magazine cover could disappear completely from history inside of 20 years, and you'd have almost no way to reconstruct it unless somebody who was there kept talking about it. Which is why the Steve Reyes connection matters so much. Reyes is in the NHRA Hall of Fame and the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame as a photographer. He spent decades documenting the sport with a camera, and his work is some of the most important visual documentation we have of this era. The fact that he shot Rinauro's car at Fremont in 1968 means there is a professional archive-quality photograph from a credentialed source of the blown hell at the track doing exactly what it was built to do. Prints of that photograph have circulated through auction sales and are documented in the WorthPoint database, and that listing is where the funny car classification label comes from. The caption on the Reyes photo calls it Ron Rinauro's 1955 Chevy funny car blown hell, reflecting the contemporary usage of 1968 where AWB blown cars on Nitro were getting called funny cars in real time. There is also confirmed moving image footage of this car. The Gassers of the 50s, 60s, and 70s DVD produced by Jim Amos at Beyond Video, catalog number 017, is a 105-minute documentary covering Gasser history at 38 track. The Fremont Raceway segment specifically includes footage of the blown hell 55 Chevy altered wheelbase Gasser under power. If you want to see this car actually move at Fremont, that's where to look. The DVD is commercially available. That's not a rumor or a second-hand account. That's documented, purchasable footage. The Fremont Dragstrip Facebook page has historical information suggesting that after the blown hell was retired, Rinauro moved to a different car in 1969, though what that car was I couldn't determine from accessible sources. There's a photograph tied to that post, but it's behind Facebook's login restrictions. So we know the blown hell had an active run from approximately 1966 through 1968, and that Rinauro kept racing after retiring it. What his 1969 program looked like and what happened to his career after that point is genuinely unknown based on the sources available right now. In the period documentation, that 1966 magazine appearance that Drive magazine describes as the source of the original car's story references the yellow dog-eared pages of a well-known magazine without naming the publication. The candidates are Hot Rod Magazine, Carcraft, Popular Hot Rodding, Drag Racing Magazine, Drag News, and Superstock and Drag Illustrated, all of which were actively covering Northern California drag racing during that period. If somebody wanted to locate the original magazine feature on the blown hell, a physical archive search of those publications from 1965 through 1967 would almost certainly find it. The NHRA Museum's Wally Parks Library in Pomona has indexed copies of major drag racing publications from this era, and that would be a logical place to start. There can't be that many feature articles on a 1955 Chevy AWB car called Blown Hell running at Fremont. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that tells you something real about what this car meant to people who saw it. Remember Jerry James, the kid at the fence in 1967. He served in Vietnam aboard the USS Ranger. He came back and got into stock car racing, then hydroplane racing. Somewhere across all of those years and all of those different racing experiences, he never stopped thinking about the 55 Chevy that sat all wrong at Fremont and made that blower noise and ran that time on the board. In 2008, James found a derelict 1955 Chevrolet body at a friend's shop. His description of what he found is pretty telling. "Pretty ragged," he said. "The body was just sitting on a different frame, not even bolted on. That is not a promising starting point for a high-quality restoration tribute." But he recognized the opportunity and committed to building a faithful recreation of what Rinauro had run. James built his tribute with a 427 cubic inch Merlin big block rather than the original small block, topped with a Mooneyham 871 blower and Hilborn injection running on methanol through a Powerglide transmission. The rear axle in his car is pushed forward 20 inches to replicate the original AWB stance. His car runs 9.17 seconds at 141 miles per hour at around 3,300 pounds. Drive magazine featured it in the January 2017 issue with writing by Rod Short, and the piece was republished on Motortopia. That Motortopia article is probably the most detailed written account of the original blown hell specifications and history that you can currently find in accessible sources online. Here's what makes this tribute specifically meaningful beyond just being a nice recreation. When Jerry James built his car, he added lettering on the front fender crediting Ted Gotelli as the engine builder of the original. He didn't have to do that. The tribute car has its own completely different engine from a different builder. But James considered the Gotelli credit essential to the car's identity. He wanted people looking at his recreation to understand where the original power came from and who made it possible. That is a choice that tells you something about how seriously Bay Area drag racing people took the Gotelli connection to Rinauro's program. The credit belonged there, and James made sure it was visible. Look, that detail is worth sitting with for a second. There are plenty of tribute builds that get built for personal satisfaction and leave the history at the door. James wasn't doing that. He was trying to preserve an accurate record of what Rinauro built and who helped him build it, right there on the fender where anyone looking at the car at a show or a track could read it. That's a form of historical documentation that serious gearheads understand intuitively even if they'd never use that phrase to describe what they're doing. Now, what happened to the original car? Here's the thing. Unknown with certainty, but maybe not entirely gone. No major auction house records show the blown hell appearing for sale at Mecum or Barrett-Jackson or similar venues. No museum currently holds it. But in 2020, the Von Skip Automotive blog posted photographs of the car, and in 2021, a commenter asked if anyone knew who owned the blown hell now. A user going by Panic Mouse replied, and I'm going to quote this exactly. "Yes, I do." Posted twice without sharing any details about where the car is or who has it. That's either someone who knows exactly where this car is and chose not to elaborate in a public blog comment section, or someone who thinks they know and might be wrong. But the specificity of it is suggestive. "Yes, I do," rather than "I think I know" or "I heard it went to somebody somewhere." If the original blown hell or significant parts of it survive in private hands somewhere in Northern California or wherever it ended up, that would be a significant find for anyone trying to document this era properly. The car deserves more than a two-word comment section reply as its final known location. A model car builder named Dave Armstrong built a scale replica of the blown hell in 2021 using a resin body and period decals and posted it to the Model Cars magazine forum. The model is painted blue. All of the period photographs I've been able to find are black and white. So what color the original car actually was is something I can't verify from documented sources. The model car color choice might be accurate based on community knowledge that circulates through this hobbyist world in ways that don't always make it into written record. Or it might be an educated guess. I'd want to see a contemporaneous written reference or a color photograph before committing to any specific color in a definitive account. Here's what most people don't realize about why the blown hell story matters beyond just being a cool car with an interesting history. The regional drag racing ecosystem that produced Rinauro and Gotelli and the Fremont and Half Moon Bay scenes was generating innovations that the national record books and the mainstream press largely didn't capture in real time. The guys running at regional tracks weren't chasing NHRA national points. They were racing for money and reputation in front of local crowds who knew what they were watching, and they were making technical decisions that reflected what was actually happening in the sport at the competitive edge. When Rinauro built the Blown Hell with its altered wheelbase and its Gotelli-sourced blown small block on 10% nitro, he was synthesizing everything that was happening in drag racing in the mid-60s into a single regional track car. The AWB concept from the factory experimentals, the blower technology from the fuel dragster world, mediated through Gotelli's direct experience with those engines. The nitro fuel mix that was becoming standard in the top altered and funny car classes. The TorqueFlite automatic that could handle the torque load in a way that let you tune your launch more precisely than a clutch setup allowed under those conditions. He put all of that together in a full steel 1955 Chevy body with a 2-foot axle relocation and ran it at Fremont and Half Moon Bay before anybody had a clean category name for what he'd built. And here's where it gets really interesting. The pro-modified class that would eventually formalize all of those ideas into a sanctioned NHRA category in the 1990s is now one of the most popular and spectacular forms of professional drag racing in the country. Cars running in the 6s and 5s in full-bodied production car shapes with superchargers, turbos, and nitrous running through engines that bear almost no relationship to anything that left a factory floor. The crowds that show up for pro-mod racing today are responding to the same basic appeal that made people stop and look when the Blown Hell came through the staging lanes in 1967. A car that looks like something recognizable but moves like something from a different category entirely, because the modifications underneath and on top of the body put it in a completely different performance universe than what the shape suggests. That's the direct lineage. And it runs straight from Rinauro's 55 Chevy at Fremont to whatever current pro-mod champion is running 5.7 seconds on the big end next weekend. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is a cool piece of history, but why does this particular car deserve this kind of attention when there were presumably hundreds of AWB cars running at regional tracks across the country in this era? And that's a fair question. The answer has a few parts. First, the Gotelli connection gives the Blown Hell a specific pedigree that most regional track cars didn't have. Ted Gotelli wasn't a regional speed shop guy. He was one of the most respected fuel engine builders on the West Coast, and his fingerprints on Rinauro's program meant the car was drawing on knowledge and expertise that was genuinely at the top of the sport. You could look at a regional track car built around Gotelli power and know that the engine side of the program was as serious as anything running anywhere. Second, the photographic and film documentation that exists for the Blown Hell is unusually strong for a regional car of this era. Steve Reyes, Hall of Fame level documentation, plus inclusion in a commercially distributed documentary DVD, plus Drive Magazine's feature on the tribute car that includes period specifications, gives historians more to work with than most cars in this category. The Blown Hell is recoverable in a way that many of its contemporaries simply aren't. Third, and this is the part that I think carries the most weight, the story of Jerry James building the tribute tells you something about the car's impact that transcends what a race result or a magazine clipping can capture. James saw this car as a teenager and carried the image of it through military service and multiple subsequent racing careers, and still cared enough decades later to build a faithful recreation. That's not a minor historical footnote. That's a measure of what the car actually meant to the people who were there when it ran. There are plenty of historically significant race cars from the 60s that you could document accurately and completely, and that would generate a sort of intellectual appreciation. You understand why they mattered. You can explain the technical significance and the competition context. And then there are cars that did something else, something that the documentation can point toward but not fully explain, which is that they got into people's heads and stayed there. The blown hell was that second kind of car. A 55 Chevy with a blower sticking through the hood and an axle 2 feet forward of where it was supposed to be, running 9.73 at 146 at a Bay Area track in the mid to late 60s. It's not a glamorous story in the traditional sense. There's no national championship. There's no Garlits-level legacy. There's no drag racing Hall of Fame plaque with Rinauro's name on it, at least not one I can find. There's a regional racer who built something genuinely ahead of its time with help from one of the most respected engine builders in California, ran it at the right tracks at the exact moment when the sport was redefining itself, and then faded from the accessible historical record in a way that left the car more documented than the man. Somewhere there's a first-person account waiting to be found, either from Rinauro himself if he's still alive and accessible, or from the people in the Bay Area racing community who knew him and can speak to what his program was actually like to be around. The archived racing publications from 1965 through 1967 might have a feature article with direct quote. The network of California drag racing historians and archivists that has done serious work preserving this era might have information that hasn't made it into the publicly accessible sources. The person going by Panic Mouse in a 2021 blog comment section might know exactly where the original car is sitting right now. What we have is this: a photograph by Steve Reyes, footage in a Jim Amos documentary, a Drive magazine feature on the Tribute, an East Coast Drag Times Hall of Fame mention, a collection of blog posts and online listings that aggregate into a partial picture, and the testimony of a man named Jerry James who saw something at Fremont in 1967 and couldn't shake it, and who put Ted Gotelli's name on the fender of his recreation because that credit belonged there and he wanted people to know it. Ron Rinauro, the blown hell. A Bay Area racer with Gotelli power and a 2-foot axle relocation and 10% nitro in a full steel 55 Chevy, running at Fremont and Half Moon Bay right at the exact moment the gasser era was ending and the funny car era was just figuring out what it was going to become. Not a national champion. Not a household name. Just a car that made people stop walking and stare, and stayed in their heads for the rest of their lives. That's the whole story, or at least as much of it as the available record lets us tell right now. If you know something we don't, if you were there, if you know where the original car is, if you're connected to Rinauro or the Bay Area racing community from this era, the comment section is exactly the right place to put that information. Because this is the kind of history that gets built incrementally through people who care enough to share what they know. If this is the kind of deep dive into forgotten racing history that you come here for, you know what to do. Subscribe, leave a thumbs up if this added something to your understanding of the era, and we'll see you in the next one.